Tom Bevan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Absolutely. Great to be with you.
So this has been a fascinating midterm for a lot of different reasons. I'm curious what you think are kind of the top line storylines that have run through over the past couple of months as we approach November.
I think that, we're sitting here, a couple of weeks away, 3 weeks away from the election. And I think the storyline to me is that the fundamentals of this election, which we've known about for months and months and months, are really starting, in my opinion, to sort of take hold. Mm-hmm. There was this narrative that sort of burst out during the summer that, the Dobbs decision was going to change the political landscape and really give Democrats a shot at holding the House and keeping the Senate, and that it was a sort of a game-changing event for Democrats. And people cited special elections and the referendum in Kansas and the like. And I think what we're seeing now is that was sort of a mirage. And I say sort of a mirage because I think it is true it energized Democrats and brought some Democrats home. If you look at the Biden's job approval rating, for example, he was at 38.6%, his all-time low in our RealClear Politics average, I think July 21st. And that was right around the Dobbs decision. And shortly thereafter, he started picking up ground. These were Democrats coming home. These were not Republicans. These were not independents that were suddenly, had disapproved of Biden and suddenly approved. These were Democrats who came home because of Dobbs and because of the legislative victories and the passage, the student debt forgiveness and those sorts of things, which progressives really, really wanted. He won back some folks on the left that he had lost. Mm-hmm. However, the data was very clear that the economy was the number one issue. I mean, it just was, has always been. And inflation has been, gas prices. I mean, pollsters asked this question in a variety of different ways. And it was an order of magnitude above anything else, certainly for Republicans, but even among independents. It was only among Democrats where we found they were more concerned about abortion. They were more concerned about protecting democracy. They were more concerned about gun rights or climate change or some of these other issues. Inflation was still way down the list. And so that, I think, led them to believe that somehow this election had changed. And I think they're seeing now what we're seeing in the data is what we've seen for a long time, but it's being reflected in, I think, some of these polls, specifically, the generic congressional ballot polls that have come out showing Republicans sort of, recapturing their lead and extending their lead to almost 2 points in a RealClear Politics average.
So I, of course, agree with you. I think that this the fundamentals and getting back to it's the economy, stupid, has been kind of the strongest narrative this cycle. But one of the things that does seem to also be an interesting part of this narrative was the effect that the Trump endorsement would have within the context, particularly of these Senate primaries, where we saw his backing lead to the nominations of a significant number of outsiders, political outsiders or relatively newcomers in terms of active politics. You have a lot of people who've never even stood for election for any office before, who've ended up being the nominees in a lot of critical races. What do you think that does? And do you think that, assuming that, let's say, a significant number of them win, I still find Arizona very difficult to predict, but I think you can pretty strongly say J.D. Vance looks to be coming along very strong. Herschel Walker just had a great debate. You have Dr. Oz, who seems to have picked up some momentum with the problems that John Fetterman has run into in Pennsylvania. You've got a series of outsider candidates, and then you've got a couple of people who have had, some political experience before, people like Markwayne Mullin in Oklahoma, like Adam Laxalt out in Nevada. Does this outsider presence have the possibility of really shaking up the U.S. Senate? Or do you think that there's going to be perhaps less impact than people might anticipate, given just sort of the dynamics at play there?
That's a great question. I mean, we won't know the answer to that until after the election, how many of these folks are going to end up winning. But I mean, certainly if a majority of them win, if you do get Herschel Walker in the Senate, Mehmet Oz, J.D. Vance, Blake Masters, then I think it does change the landscape of the Senate. Mitch McConnell's going to have the same problem, even if Republicans have a good night. Mitch McConnell's going to have the same problem that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have now, which is, I've got 2 seats and I've got, I've got Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney still there. And I mean, it's going to be a mess. And then you're going to have the folks like Blake Masters who, and JD Vance who've been pretty outspoken at some points during this campaign. They've sort of gone back and forth with Mitch McConnell. And so I think it is going to present some real interesting issues. But, the outsider thing is, and you look at the landscape, I mean, Trump basically won all of these primaries. Everybody he endorsed came through. And I mean, there were a couple of places he didn't endorse New Hampshire, for example, but the Trumpy candidate won there. You remember Missouri, he endorsed Eric, and it was like, because both candidates were called Eric. So, I mean, there were a couple of funny little moments there, but by and large,
certainly he cleared the field for someone like Herschel,
yes. And so,
primary otherwise. Yeah.
Yes. And so, if Herschel does not get across the finish line there, the goal line, if we want to use the football pun, that's going to be one that's going to end up on Trump. That's a race that the Republicans probably should win in a year like this. Again, you look at whatever the metrics you want to look at, Joe Biden's job approval rating, inflation numbers, I mean, all this stuff, direction of the country, it's all favoring Republicans. And so if they don't win, a few of these seats, and what's fascinating to me about this, Ben, is that you've got situations where in that race in particular, Brian Kemp is leading Stacey Abrams by 7, 8, 9 points. It's pretty consistently among all the polls. There's no poll that really they've really clustered around the idea that
he could win by 10. Yeah,
he could win by 10. He could win by 12. And it's like, so you think to yourself, okay, if Kemp wins by 12, is there really a scenario where Herschel Walker doesn't win by a point or 2? Yeah. Is he really going to run 13, 14 points behind Brian Kemp? Are there really that many Republicans that are going to go vote for Brian Kemp and then say to Herschel, in this sort of tribal partisan atmosphere where people are going to say, no, I'm just not going to vote I'm going to leave that spot blank. I can't believe they'd actually be, maybe there are Kemp Warnock voters out there. And we saw that, for example, in 2018 with Doug Ducey, popular incumbent Republican governor, and Martha McSally. Ducey won by 12 or 14 points and she failed. Now, I would argue that Kyrsten Sinema is more ideologically a fit for Arizona than Raphael Warnock is for Georgia, but he is an incumbent. So he has an advantage of incumbency to the extent you can say that in a year like this year where being the in party is almost in many ways a drag.
Yeah. One thing that's an interesting dynamic and I feel like you made mention of it has been this relationship between Rick Scott at the head of the NRSC, Mitch McConnell and his own fundraising operation, and the way that these primaries kind of played out, which often had pretty expensive races, certainly in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where at the end of the day, you had guys who didn't have a lot of money and hadn't had the political background of building up a fundraising operation. And Donald Trump basically gets a lot of these small dollar donations that flow to him instead of going to these various candidates, and has been to this point really reluctant, it seems like, to put any money behind them. In a situation where a couple of these folks don't get across the finish line with a victory, is part of the blame game that would come after that basically one of, well, Trump helped pick these candidates, but then he basically left them for their own devices in large part, without giving them the kind of financial backing that he maybe could have in order to achieve a Republican Senate.
Maybe, but again, it depends on the outcome. I mean, do Republicans, do they win the Senate and pick up a seat, but they don't, a couple of other folks lose, or does it, if it stays 50-50, if Republicans don't win the Senate, then there will be recriminations. There will be, you'll be able to pinpoint exactly where the Republicans fell down in a year that, they probably should have won control of the Senate. So, and part of that will be Trump. There's no question. I think probably more on the nomination side than the money side.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I mean, again,
I still am not convinced, though, that like if things had played out differently, that you would have had a better set of candidates. I mean, maybe you could say Pennsylvania, but I also think that, there's in a lot of these cases, it's kind of a coin flip. I mean, it's not like, sure, J.D. Vance is a political neophyte, but I think that, Josh Mandel has proven himself that he can lose the state of Ohio. So, this is not an either or here necessarily. You mentioned, of course, the polling averages, which is central to everyone's knowledge of the importance of RealClear Politics this time of year. There's been a number.
Here it comes.
No, there's been a number of articles lately about the difficulty and levels of inaccuracy of pollsters in this moment, and you had that Times article just the other day about how few people will actually respond when they are called. When you're looking at those averages, how much are you taking it as being this is where the race is, and how much is in the back of your head just sort of going, yeah, this is maybe where the race is, but in my own head, I'm personally shading it a couple points in a certain direction because I think that this is, we have a problem when it comes to polling in America.
Right. So, and we started seeing this a few weeks ago. Nate Cohn at the New York Times wrote that, are the polls wrong again? And that set off a whole series of articles basically asking the same question. Time Magazine, across the board, everyone was sort of writing this idea, okay, are the polls off again? And it's unknowable, right? It's unknowable. So I do think, though, there has been a loss of trust in polling over the last few cycles. I mean, there's just no question about it. I think it's wrong to say that all polling is broken because there have been some pollsters like Trafalgar and others who have been way more accurate. And so there have been some pollsters. And remember, in 2016, Trafalgar, he shows up and he's got this sort of, unorthodox method of trying to figure out what's going on there and how to poll these races. And he was derided and dismissed by the mainstream media and all the polling experts. And he turned out to be way more accurate than they were in 2016. Now he's considered, an A plus pollster or A pollster by 538. And he's so you do have, and you've got some other polling groups that have done good work over the last three cycles, but you've also got the university funded places. You've got some of the big media organizations. Everyone points to, the Washington Post poll, Biden wins Wisconsin by 17 points. I mean, those kind of big misses. And so it does beg the question, okay, where are we exactly? And so one of the things that we've done is we went back and looked at all these individual states and the races in 2016, 2018, 2020, and said, okay, how far were the polls off? Did they underestimate one party or another, and by how much? Just as another way of sort of trying to answer that question, right? If the pattern holds over the last three cycles in these races, what would be the final outcome? And we have a chart on RealClear Politics you can find, and it says, for today, 23 days from election, this is what the polls in let's say Pennsylvania underestimated the support. I think it's about by 5.5 or 6 points, right? So that race is a 3.5 point race right now. So if the polls are off in the same way they have been over the last three cycles in Pennsylvania, Mehmet Oz would be ahead by a couple points in that race. Ohio, for example, they've got it our average has it a 1.5 point race right now. J.D. Vance is leading. Ohio has been one of those states that, the Midwest in general has been ground zero for polling misses. So, that was a Trump +8 state, underestimated Republican support by 9.5 points. So you've got J.D. Vance winning Ohio by perhaps double digits. In a place like Nevada, though, where you've got Adam Laxalt leading by a couple points, polls have underestimated over the last three cycles. They've underestimated Democratic support by about 0.8 of a percentage point, right? And that's the remnants of the Harry Reid machine. They always seem to, Democrats always seem to be able to turn out the Culinary Workers Union and the like in Clark County and overperform the polls. So in that race, Adam Laxalt's, he's up 1.5 points on our average. Polls have overestimated, or underestimated Democrats by about almost a point. So that's probably, if that holds, that's a really, really close race. And then in Georgia's the other one where, again, we were just talking about, is it really going to be the situation? The polls they were even basically in Georgia. They were actually spot on over the last three cycles. And so you look at Warnock's lead at, I think it's like 3.8%. And you got to think to yourself, okay, well, then maybe that is 3.5%. That really is where the thing is, the race is at, even though, again, Brian Kemp's leading by 7 or 8 points. So that's just another way that we've tried to address the issue of whether the polls are accurate or not. And if they aren't accurate, which way might they be off? But again, this is all going to be unknowable. And again, we're going to wake up November 9th and have a sense of who got it right and who got it wrong. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that we announced last week that we're going to be doing this RealClear Politics polling accountability initiative. And we're going to be rolling that out in the coming couple of weeks, and then taking a look at pollsters' historical performance over the last few cycles and moving ahead. Because the one thing that has been missing is accountability. I mean, the same folks that have been off over the last few cycles, nothing happens. There's no accountability. There's no consequences for being that wrong. And that's just that's not tolerable. It undermines public trust, and it's something we got to fix.
I was listening the other day to one of the very prominent Barstool sports podcasts, Pardon My Take. They track over the course of the season the performance of their bets. So everybody's making 4 picks basically every week for the NFL. And they're picking a favorite, an underdog, an over, and an under. Okay. And they track their performance. And they have a guy who comes on and tells them their performance. And, sometimes some of these guys go 0-4, and I I applaud them as degenerate gamblers for owning their mistakes and actually being public about it. And as I was listening to it the other day, and I had just been having a conversation with someone about polling, I was like, we don't even have this level of accountability from pollsters, whose words we're supposed to, we build entire articles and narratives based on the assumptions that flow out of these pollsters into our conversation. And yet they don't own their own mistakes. They don't own their own failures, even to that level of a degree. Is there a way to change that? And is this accountability project that you're going to change that, or aimed at changing that?
Yes, that is what we're going to try and do. And that's, again, take a look at these pollsters and measure them simply on accuracy. How accurate were you? How accurately did your polling reflect the outcome on election day? And because that's the only metric that really matters. That's the only metric that the public cares about. That's the metric that will rebuild public trust if you're to be more accurate. I mean, we really want this to be a constructive thing for the polling industry, because it's in everybody's best interest to be as accurate as possible and not to be way off the mark. And again, to your point, some of these polls that are inaccurate, they get a lot of attention. I mean, they really do. The media sort of hones in on them, generate headlines, shift narratives, and you've even got polling operations out there this cycle that are simply trying to manipulate not only media coverage but some of the averages. I mean, you've got this group Center Street PAC that it's funded by it's run by Joe Walsh, who's a sort of a serious never Trumper, and another guy. And they're putting out polls. They've got Tim Ryan up 11 points in Ohio and Fetterman up 19 and, Mark Kelly up 15 or something. And they've actually they're on record endorsing those candidates. And some people are including those in their averages and their models, which is insane. So I think we do have to, part of what we're going to do is try and hold some of these pollsters accountable. That's the only way that I think you're going to get any sort of movement toward more accountability. Otherwise, it's just the same old, it's the same. It'll be the same 2 years from now and 4 years from now, and folks will just continue to do what they're doing without really reforming or taking a seriously hard look at how they can be better and be more accurate.
As someone who's more in the business of focusing on policy making and idea-based debates in between elections as opposed to elections, I have to say it is constantly infuriating to me to have the experience of seeing a pollster totally botch an election prediction, and then be used to make an argument on the side of a policy debate 6 months later. Right. You know? And it's just like, I mean, is everybody taking crazy pills here? You know, I'm telling you, you can't trust them on this stuff. One area that is of particular focus for this kind of narrative conversation that is based around elections and polling is obviously the Hispanic vote in America, which has been at the center of a optimistic Republican frame of what's been going on, and has really been seen as offsetting perhaps losses that have happened among upper income and college educated women in the Republican coalition. What is the challenge when it comes to getting accurate depictions of what Hispanic voters want? Because it does seem like there's been more attention to them paid to them by pollsters and by people who are trying to figure out kind of what's your priority set, especially in the wake of the result in Virginia, which it seemed like snuck up a lot on the sort of dominant corporate media. Do you think that that's something that is improving? Is that tracking in the right direction in terms of pollsters being able to figure out what Hispanic voters want?
I think so. I mean, I think there is a general sense, you know, the media often treats Hispanics as this monolith, right? And views them in that way. And it's actually obviously more complicated than that. And it's complicated geographically, right? You've got the, Cuban American population in Miami, which is different from the Hispanic Mexican American population in Nevada and Arizona, which is, probably different from some of the Hispanic voters in Georgia or in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin. But generally, I think the data is pretty clear, though. I mean, that Republicans have improved their standing with Hispanic voters, and obviously, that happened with Trump in 2020 in South Texas, and we've seen that continue through this election cycle. These are counties and areas that haven't been won by Republicans since Reconstruction. You've now got, Hispanic female candidates there running strong campaigns. And so I think it is true. And that was one of the, we'll see. But I think the appeal the Republicans have, there was always a sense that, well, Hispanic voters are more culturally conservative on issues like marriage and abortion, and therefore they fit better into the GOP coalition. But I honestly think it's more, as it is with everyone this time, broad-based across. It's economics. I mean, it's class. These are, inflation hits the working class the hardest. The people who are less concerned about inflation are the ones who have the most money, right? The upper class, which, at this point in the game are still are Democrats. Republicans have really become the party of the working class and are talking to those issues. And that's why I think Hispanic voters, among others, have responded, because they're, again, the data is pretty clear. It is by far the most urgent, most important issue on the minds of voters. It's not even close. It's 75, 80, 85, 90%. And Republicans are speaking to that, and Democrats are focused, as you might expect. I mean, it's the economy and inflation is not a good talking point for them. You saw Michael Bennett on TV trying to, answer why the Inflation Reduction Act hasn't reduced inflation as it's named and supposed to do. And he said, look, it takes a while for these things to kick in. I mean, it was kind of painful to watch. So Democrats are focused on trying to motivate their base through abortion and other issues. The problem is that makes them look out of touch to independents and others who want them to talk about what they're going to do to help, lower the price of gas, lower the cost of food.
So we've been through this experience before historically. You have a Democrat come in, engage in some overreach that's happened in different varieties under Bill Clinton, under Obama, and now under Joe Biden. And they head into a midterm where it looks like they're going to get smacked. And we saw that in 94 and we saw that in 2010. However, one of the things that seems to have been different about the 2010 situation is that as much as the Tea Party changed the conversation in Washington, it didn't really have that significant of an impact when it came to fiscal policy. You had a handful of wins and you had some bigger priorities, but you didn't really see the kind of change on the scale that they demanded, and you certainly didn't see that flow into 2012 in the way that a lot of people anticipated that energy to flow, in part because of picking Mitt Romney, which, that's worth another whole podcast. But
right.
the thing that's interesting to me about this election is, okay, let's assume that we're about to see the same kind of thing. How should Republicans approach holding on to this coalition that you're describing and speaking to these working class priorities? Because as much as they can talk about it when they're out of power, when they get power, they may not be able to do as much as they'd like to, other than just block things that Joe Biden would like to do.
Right. And I kind of touched on this earlier, right? So say Republicans have a good night in the House and win 25 House seats and 1 or 2 Senate seats, take control of both chambers. What can they get done legislatively with those kind of margins? Could Kevin McCarthy keep everybody together and push some stuff through the House? Sure. Could Mitch McConnell use reconciliation to push it through the Senate? Sure. It's possible. And what happens? Joe Biden's sitting there with a veto pen for the next 2 years. Yeah. So there's nothing that's going to get done that Joe Biden doesn't want to get done, because they won't be able to override any vetoes. Legislatively, it's going to be difficult, I think, for Republicans. Joe Biden's not going to sign off on a tax cut. He's not going to sign off on any of these things. And so then it comes down to in the House, oversight obviously is something that Republicans would engage in pretty robustly. I think there's even talk of impeachment. Whether it's Joe Biden or Mayorkas or somebody, I think there is anger out there, and I think Republicans want to.
Democrats might give up Mayorkas at this point.
They might. They might.
Who knows? In terms of a job,
and there might be some things that they can do, some regulatory stuff through some of the committees. But in the Senate, it would be all about judges. I mean, taking back control of the Judiciary Committee, and that's not nothing for Republican voters. But to your point, if the rationale for this election, putting Republicans in power in the House and Senate, is to fix the economy, fix inflation, get this stuff worked out, I'm not sure they're going to be able to do a whole lot. On that issue, on those issues, given the current environment, and then you'll have, 2024. The Democrats say, well, the Republicans have had Congress for the last 2 years and haven't done anything, and Republicans will be put in a position of saying, yeah, we had Congress, but we had a Democratic president. That's why we need a Republican president in 2024, so we can really get stuff done. So it'll be the same arguments that we've been hearing for the last few cycles.
So, final and most important question: is Geno Smith a guy? Do you think you got a guy there?
Listen, yes, I'm a buyer of Geno right now, and I got to tell you, when Russ left, obviously the conventional wisdom is you need an elite quarterback to really win in this league, and I sort of bought into that. But Geno, when he was in last year, when Russ was hurt, didn't play bad. He had a couple turnovers, at the end of a game, but he played pretty well. And this year he's been playing very well. And, when you score whatever it was, 42 points or whatever it is against the, New Orleans Saints, you should win those games. You score 30 plus points, you should win those games. Your defense should be able to allow you to win those games. So look, 3-3, we're tied for the lead in the NFC West along with a couple other teams. So, so far so good. And we've got some work to do.
I buy into Geno. I think that he may make the calculation very interesting in this coming off season. So, and
you'll appreciate this, Ben. When he was named the starter of the Seahawks, the New York Post ran a headline that said, "Former Jets and Giants flop, now starter for Seahawks," which was classic New York Post. But that's how they feel about him in New York. But he's a different quarterback now. He looks good.
Yeah. The coastal switch was what he needed. So, Tom, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today and to walk us through all of this.
Absolutely.